Hey everybody, thanks for tuning in to today's episode of Real Talk. It's Lucas here, and I hope that today's episode informs and inspires you to have your own real conversations. As always, today's episode is brought to you by our friends over at Trivan, maker of trucks, trailers, and enclosure buildings tailored to your needs. Be sure to check them out at trivan.com. A huge thanks to them for sponsoring the show and making it possible. One other quick note before we get into today's episode is that if you are willing and able, if you could leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on any of the podcast networks or platforms that allow for it, such as Spotify or Apple Podcast, that will be much appreciated as it helps get the word out there and lets people know what we're all about. So, with that in mind, on to the episode. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Real Talk Podcast. We are back today for another episode with a familiar face, starting to become quite a familiar face around here, Pastor Jim Witteveen. He was a guest earlier on in the show, and then we recently had him back on for a roundup episode, which was a lot of fun. So first off, thank you for joining the show again, Pastor Jim.
Well, thanks, Lucas. It's nice to be here. I'm glad to have the opportunity to talk with you once again.
Yes, it's exciting. And I think as we teased a little bit in the last time you were on the show, today's topic, we're going to be talking about your new book, How in the World Did We Get Here? And basically this book tracks through the changes in history in terms of where we find ourselves in the world today and the vast amount of conspiracy theories that are going on. The so-called elites, people talk about the elites a lot, and people want to know, okay, what is going on there? How do we make sense of this? What are people trying to do in the world? Is there a vast conspiracy? Is this all, is the devil at play here? What is going on? There's so much misinformation and things we just don't know, and forces at work that we just don't understand. So as Christians, it's important to stay informed and, be able to use scripture to sort through the lies and the mistruths of the world and to see where we stand and where things are going. So with that in mind, I think that's kind of the tack you were taking with this book. So I want to kind of jump into it straight away because there's a ton of great material to get to. So maybe if you can give us a brief outline, a lot better than I just did there, of what is your book about. Give us the outline and kind of go from there.
Okay. Well, basically my purpose in writing the book was to outline basically, the answer to the question, how in the world did we get here? How did we arrive in a place in history when there are so many movements and so many different kind of ideologies that are at play, powerful ideologies that are really opposing the message of Christ and His kingdom? And there's a number that we'll go through that I'm sure in this episode that I talk about in the book. And what's the history of these movements and what lies behind them? And also what kind of unites these movements? Why we can really speak about a vast conspiracy. And, one of the things that I always say is that I'm not a conspiracy theorist, but I'm a conspiracy realist. So that's where I'm coming from. And what I want to do is equip people to understand what these movements are, where they come from, and how we can play our part in the battle in which we are involved.
Mm-hmm, for sure. Okay, well, to start off, maybe we'll look at the title. So you chose a very specific title. Can you tell us a bit what you mean by the word here, and also why you use the word world in that title?
Okay. Yeah, because it's we always say things like that, right? How in the world did this happen, or whatever? But I chose the title specifically because we know from Scripture that our battle, we are involved in a battle as God's people, and will be until Christ returns, and that our battle is not against flesh and blood, but we need the armor of God to fight a spiritual battle. And so the ultimate answer to the question is, why are things the way they are? Well, it's because of the existence of evil in the world. We live in a fallen world. But then we need to ask, okay, well, how do these forces of evil play themselves out in this world? And what are the means that our enemy uses in order to try to accomplish his purposes? In his what will obviously be a failed attempt to accomplish its purposes. So when I say how in the world did we get here, I'm looking at the movements and the currents and the earthly forces that are being used by the evil one in his battle against Christ, against his kingdom. And whereas here is the world of all these movements, such as the various sexual revolutions that we are living through at the moment. Most recently, among them, the whole transgender movement. The sexual revolution, the breakdown of the family, where these things are being encouraged and worsened. A world in which the radical environmentalist movement has taken center stage in governments and in positions of power, where transhumanism, the ideology of transhumanism, has also come to the forefront, and how the various levels of the elites in world society are working together to promote a united agenda on all of these fronts. So that's here. That's the world that we're in. So how in the world? What are the earthly forces that are at play? Did we get here to this place where we live in a tolerant society that's intolerant of us as Christians?
Yes. Okay, so before we get into all these forces at play, we're going to walk through all the forces you talk about in your book. I think it's important to address off the top some pushback from people who might say, well, okay, of course, we know this is a fallen world and there's plenty of evil, and the devil is certainly going to be up to his usual tricks. But why do we even need to know or to care about this? Like, we have the final victory in Christ. Do we have to really engage with the world and really, like, what's the point of knowing how in the world did we get here if we have the spiritual victory already?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I think it's an important one. It's one I considered as I was writing the book as well. And really, I think there's two purposes, or I had two purposes behind writing this book, and that comes to the kernel or the core of the question. First of all, we need to know and understand these things so that we can avoid getting sucked in ourselves by these movements. And I outline in the book as well a number of areas in which the church has been, or the evangelical church or the church in general, or parts of it have been led astray by these movements. So to avoid falling into these traps ourselves, and also to help our brothers and sisters to avoid falling into those traps. But also, another reason why I believe strongly that we need to understand these things is because of the nature of the warfare in which we're involved. And I continue to come back to that figure, that scriptural image of warfare. Because in order to be able to fight proficiently, we need to understand the lay of the land. And an army needs to understand what are the fronts that the army is fighting on? Who are they fighting against? What are the weapons that they're using? How can we equip ourselves to withstand those weapons and to know the terrain and all of those things, to use that battlefield imagery? I think that's extremely important for us to know that, to be able to engage. Because one of the verses that I quote in the book is Romans 16, verse 20, which I believe is extremely important, because it mitigates against any idea of a kind of passive fatalism on our part, knowing that Christ has won the victory, and praise be to God. Because of that, we can fight this fight knowing that we're on the winning side and knowing that the victory has already been won. But that should never lead us to become passive and say, well, Christ has won the victory. All we need to do is just we need to live our lives and not worry about these things. Because Paul says in Romans 16, verse 20, he says, the God of peace will soon crush Satan under your feet. So we have the battle between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent. It goes back to Genesis 3, verse 15. And we see in Romans 16, verse 20, the role that we have to play in that, the role that we as church and the role that we as individual Christians have to play in that. God does this work, but he does it using means. And by his grace and in his goodness, we have the privilege of being able to work on his behalf, to be involved integrally in this battle against the serpent, and knowing that the God of peace is working through us and by means of us to crush Satan under our feet. And so I think those are really the important, the impetus behind this and why we should be informed. Because if we're not informed, we're going to be led astray and we're not going to be able to do battle as we should.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Do you think the desire, or I shouldn't say desire, but the thought behind, oh, we don't need to do battle, is that one of like the devil's tricks to kind of get us to disengage? Like I'm reading this book, he talked about a kind of a Cold War and a hot war. And at times, he will use a bit of a Cold War strategy. Do you think we're being lulled into a sense that, we don't really need to engage?
Honestly, I do think that over the past decades, we have, as Western Christians, as North American Christians,
Sure.
European Christians, we've been lulled into a kind of a false sense of security. And that is that kind of Cold War aspect. So I speak about in the book, I speak about the fact that the war is always on. At times, it seems like a so-called hot war, where the battle lines are evident, where it's very clear. You can think of old Soviet Russia, or you can think of Muslim countries, or you can think of China, where Christians are overtly and have overtly been persecuted. And you can think of that as a hot war kind of situation. But in other places, it's more of a Cold War situation, where it's easy to get lulled into a false sense of not security, because we should always be secure, but a false sense of thinking that there is peace, where actually there is no peace, because peace between the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent can never exist. So the war is always ongoing. And I do think that over the past decades, we have as church been led to have that false sense of, things are not that bad, and not understanding that the war is being waged, oftentimes in subtle ways, but more recently, I would say less and less subtle ways and more obvious ways.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. Okay, so now let's take some time to launch into the different forces at play when we're talking about these conspiracies that conspiracy realists, as yourself, have looked into. So I think we should start with, when you start within the book, talking about idols. Because that's at the end of the day, it's this idol of power. Well, there's many idols you get into, but the idol of power being one of the primary ones that mankind is after when he creates these conspiracies and sets himself up against God, right? So can you explain for myself and for the listeners this idea of idols, how it's changed over history, and the kind of idols that are at play today?
I think the best way to look at it is, obviously, idolatry is a central sin of the fallen human race, and the most basic form of idolatry is self-idolatry, where the human self, where I, or the human being, places himself on the throne, places himself at the center, makes himself God, and wants to cast the true God off of his throne, the true king. And over time, and what we see happening over the course of history, in biblical times, the gods were gods of wood and stone, the gods of the forces of nature, Baal and Asheroth, and the various other gods that were they were personifications of natural forces. Baal was the storm god, and they were gods of sexuality and gods of reproduction, gods of fertility. Whereas today, we don't have so much. There are some places in the world where those kinds of gods are still extant, but in the Western world particularly, we have gods that are not physical in nature in that way, or physical representations of these spiritual forces, but their ideologies, their ideas. And so they become, it's actually no different really from Baal, no different from Ashtaroth. There's still gods of fertility and gods of success and gods of sexuality, but they've taken different forms. And so those are some of the, the false gods of the 21st century. Mm-hmm. But one of the great, I think the overarching false god is the god of power. And the way I describe it is that there are kind of like two levels that we can look at. And first of all, talking about the elites of the world. And in talking about the elites of the world, I'm speaking in terms of Psalm 2, how the kings of the earth conspire together against the Lord and his anointed. And those kings of the earth are not necessarily those people who we think of as being kings of the earth. It's not necessarily the politicians. It's not necessarily the prime minister or the president, but it's the so-called power behind the throne, who are the true elites who use political processes, who use politicians, who use leaders in other areas for their own purposes. And for those elites, be they individuals, or be they organizations, or be they foundations, or what have you, for those elites, the ultimate goal is power. And one of the things that an expression that's often heard is the expression "follow the money." If you want to know where something's coming from or why something's happening, follow the money. See who's going to gain financially from this decision. But I think when we think of the super elites of this world, the 1% of the 1%, those people are motivated not so much by money as they are by power. And for them, power has become the god, because they believe they're true believers. And that's something that we need to understand, is that they're true believers in their own ideology. So they're not people who are just using an ideology for some purpose, or who don't really believe in anything, but they believe in their ideology, and they believe that with their power, they will be able to implement their ideology and create utopia, create heaven on earth using that ideology. And so what ends up happening is those who worship the god of power end up manipulating those who worship other false gods, whether it might be the god of socialism, or the god of communism, or the god of capitalism, or the god of liberal democracy, or the god of personal pleasure, or sexuality, or freedom, or whatever it may be, using those people on the lower levels to accomplish their own goals. So throughout, you see idolatry, but idolatry that works itself out in different ways.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Using the useful idiots who have a cause that is below or subservient to the power cause, I suppose, right? So
exactly. To use the phrase that Lenin used.
Yes, exactly.
The phrase useful idiots.
Yeah. So if they're chasing power and they want power to create a utopia, do you think this is still like, well, we know the heart of man is simple. Is it just a simple desire to create a utopia? Or do you think, like, what is at the heart of that all at the end of the day? Like, why do humans ultimately crave power? Is it because it's the hardest thing to get? Like, even harder than to get a lot of money? Like, there's definitely lots of people with a lot of money, but the people with power are even fewer. Is it just because it's the hardest thing to do?
Well, I think there's something to that. People will look for a challenge throughout their lives, and if they seem to have achieved it all, they want to achieve more. There's never enough.
Yeah.
For those who have money, there's never enough money. For those who have power, there's never enough power. For those who are addicted to sex, there's never enough sex. All of these things. We fallen man never has enough. But ultimately, I think what's behind it is a rejection of the truth of God's truth, and the embracing of an anti-God truth. So an antichrist at work, basically, putting themselves in the place of Christ. So So in not believing that there is such a thing as eternal salvation, believing that this life is all that there is. So there's nothing beyond this life. So whatever we accomplish, we have to accomplish in this life. And whatever imprint we're going to leave on the world, we're going to have to do it here and now. And if you have power, you can do that. And so there are a lot of people who think, among the so-called elites of society, who have very long-term goals in mind. They're not just thinking about today. They're not just living for today. They're thinking about future generations. They're thinking down the road, in some cases, even millions of years. One book that I've read is called The Next Million Years. And it's Francis Galton Darwin, a descendant of Charles Darwin, who wrote that book, and forecasting the future for the next million years, what the human race is going to accomplish. So if God doesn't exist, if salvation in a biblical sense doesn't exist, then something or someone is going to be put in its place. And so it becomes earthly salvation under a human God, earned in the way that humans come up with. Mm-hmm. And so that's ultimately kind of the utopian dream, or the impulse towards utopia.
Yeah, they're really chasing immortality at the end of the day, either through their impact and their ideas, or even we'll get into transhumanism later, but being able to live on in various ways throughout time.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just take a pause here for a second. So I can imagine, I don't know exactly what all the political views of our listeners are, but hopefully there's people on both sides of the spectrum somewhat. However, you do reference the spectrum in your book, and you do mention how it's the left-right political spectrum that we're all fairly accustomed to. Is A, somewhat outdated, and B, doesn't really apply when you're talking about the elites. So if I were to just put myself in the shoes of someone who's more of a left-leaning person, but still a faithful Christian, and they're going, okay, so Lucas and Jim here are kind of going off the deep end. They're really getting into this whole conspiracy thing. I don't know. This seems like kind of a right-wing rabbit trail. There's plenty of these people who kind of go off the deep end with all these conspiracies. Now let's kind of back up and get to a bit of proof here. You talk about the open conspiracy with Wells and whatnot. Can you kind of talk about how this is not really secret whatsoever, and actually doing it out in the open is part of the strategy?
Right. Exactly. That's really one of the things where the whole term conspiracy theorist becomes this pejorative term that's used against people. You believe that there's a group of people, perhaps of a certain race or a certain ethnic group, or from a certain place, a secret society that's working in a back room somewhere, a smoke-filled room in some, evil headquarters somewhere in a cave, so whatever. And they're secretly controlling everything in the world. Well, that's absolutely not the case. And what is the case is, and you mentioned H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells was one of the elites, the intellectual elites of the early 20th century. Most well known for his works of science fiction now, probably. But at the time, he was very, very influential in the political, the sociological sphere. And he spoke of, and he wrote a book with the title The Open Conspiracy. And what he said is that we, and he included himself in this as a member of the elite, we need to work in such a way so that we can get everybody on board to join forces in our conspiracy. So he used these words, and he used them openly to speak about an open conspiracy, because he said a secret conspiracy is not going to work. It needs to be an open conspiracy because it needs to welcome people from every corner. And we need to get these people on our side. So whether it's the socialists, or whether it's the Marxists, or whether at that time it was the eugenicists, or whether it was the people who believed in science, or the Christians, or whoever it may be, we need to get them on our side in service to this elite idea of what should happen to the world. And so what ends up happening is that the leadership in these various movements becomes more or less a pawn in a greater game. And so they're played off against each other. And I'm speaking to you from Brazil. And here in Brazil, they speak about the scissors of the two sides of the political spectrum. And so it's like it's like the two sides of the scissors. So the left and the right are really not, when you get to the actual top, they're not all that different from one another. They might have different perspectives on some things. They might not agree on everything. But when you get to the top of the pyramid, there's far less disagreement than there is amongst the rabble, you and I, people at the bottom. So you have people on the left and you have people on the right, and they're fighting with each other at the grassroots level. Whereas the people who are at the top are dining together, they're friends, they get along, they go to their banquets and they go to their sporting events and they sit in the same luxury boxes. And, when one real good example of this is when a couple of years ago, when there was this big controversy when Ellen DeGeneres was sitting in a football luxury box with George W. Bush. And then they were enjoying the football game together, and people on the left were screaming about Ellen DeGeneres, getting together with somebody from far right figure like George W. Bush. People on the right were screaming about George W. Bush getting together with this left wing figure, but they got along quite well. And another example is, prior to becoming president, Donald Trump had a lot of good things to say about the Clintons, and they were friends. So where is the difference in that? And so I look at, the way I look at it is, oftentimes this left-right dichotomy is something that is actually being used to divide us. And the differences are not as clear-cut as we would like to imagine that they are. And I think for us as Christians, this is particularly helpful to understand this, because we may be tempted, and I think we often are tempted, to put our trust in one side of the political spectrum, and say, if only we could get a conservative in power, particularly, conservative Christians, they'll say, if only we could get a conservative in power, or in the States, if only we can get a Republican in power, then things will be different. But if you really look at the history, and if you really look at even presidents in the United States who were considered to be far right-wing conservative presidents, like Richard Nixon, for example, you look at their actual policies, or even Ronald Reagan, and you look at their policies, and a lot of things that happened during their terms in office had very little to do with conservative or even especially Christian principles. And a lot of the kind of movements, that goes back from conservative Canada, conservative to liberal, liberal to conservative, but the main movements remain the same behind the scenes.
Yeah, you could see it, like you said earlier, about following the money. If you look at the biggest money maker, it's going to be war and the military-industrial complex in the States. It doesn't matter if it's Republican or Democrat. That thing just keeps chugging.
Well, exactly. That's exactly, and that's one of the, that's one of the central players when we think of the power players in the world. When we think of the elites, the military-industrial complex is right in there, and heavily involved also in Silicon Valley and big tech, which are some the other one of the other power players in the world today.
Okay, so this is now good. Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, and that doesn't know that that kind of thinking doesn't know left or right. Barack Obama won the Nobel Peace Prize, which was really one of the most ridiculous things to ever happen. As Barack Obama, he preached peace. He said all the right things. He said very nice words. But, under which president did the most drone strikes happen in the Middle East? Under Barack Obama, who even joked about the use of drones in public speeches and things like that. So to say, well, that side is going to save us, that side is going to seek peace. Well, as it turns out, they certainly didn't. So there was a continuity between the first George Bush Bill Clinton, the second George Bush, Barack Obama, Donald Trump, and now Joe Biden. To look at the United States as an example, there's that continuity all along the line. Although the average person said, "Oh, well, now we have our guy in office. Things are going to change."
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't change.
No, it just keeps going on. Okay, right. So now we have a good segue into propaganda, because as we've seen, at the end of the day, at the top of the scissors, if you will, it's all actually very similar, and the elites are not actually so much left or right as just power and money. Mm-hmm. So they will use propaganda to get the left and the right mobilized against each other, and to mobilize lesser forces for their own deeds and whatnot, and for their own purposes. So how does that propaganda start and get spread today? You used a metaphor I found helpful about cattle when you were talking about propaganda in the book.
Yeah, the metaphor about cattle is, I think it's an apt one, because it's particularly apt in the social media age, and mm-hmm. the age of algorithms, where everything that we see, everything that's fed to us, is by means of algorithms. So whether we're on Facebook or using Twitter or using Instagram, whatever the social network, or even the news sites that we look at, those algorithms are herding us in a direction. And so we're actually being herded into echo chambers. We're herded into places where we're going to hear things that we want to hear, and we're also being herded into places where those who control the means of divulgation of the news or opinion pieces, where they want us to go, where the other voices that don't agree, that go against the great narrative, are basically pushed to the side, silenced. Even and most recently, we've seen it over the past couple of years, voices being excluded from the conversation because they're called harmful disinformation or misinformation, or the accusation is made that, well, it's Russian bots, that they're the ones who are spreading this misinformation or disinformation, or whatever other. And this is where, other conspiracy theories. Well, it's Russian bots. Well, not really. No, it's not. But it's actual people who are saying these things and who have their opinions. So we're being herded like cattle down different chutes to places where the rancher wants us to go. And you know what the end of cattle is when they get to the end of that last chute. They go to their own slaughter. So we need to be very much aware of that. We need to be aware of, when it comes to propaganda, we need to be aware of the means that are being used to manipulate us. And that's where I think we need to seriously work to propaganda-proof ourselves and our children and our young people, because we're being bombarded with it.
Totally. You mentioned in the book too about how modern society is set up now. How we're so we're just atomatized and individualistic, and we don't have these mediating structures between us and the government. Can you go into that a little bit, and how that plays into propaganda being able to be spread that much more easily?
Yeah, the person who is the most susceptible to propaganda is the person who doesn't have what you could call a support network, or you mentioned the word mediating institution, between the individual and the organ or the group or the organization that is behind the propaganda. And so the individual stands alone. And our society is extremely individualized, and I don't believe that's by accident. The family itself, in so many ways, has come under attack. The church as well, even other organizations, non-religious organizations, clubs, and local philanthropic organizations, women's clubs, men's clubs, societies in neighborhoods and things like that have fallen by the wayside, so that in large part it's the individual and the state that exists. And so there's nothing between to help with that. So I use a couple of examples in the book of like a modern family where everyone is going their own separate way all day. The kids are in programs. They're in school all day. They're in programs after school. The family doesn't even eat together. They basically live under the same roof. Everybody's on their devices all the time. They're being bombarded from without, but they don't have anything strengthening them around them. It's like a single tree is going to have a very hard time when the storm comes. But you have a forest full of trees. They support each other, and that's exactly the image that we need to have in mind when we think about propaganda. And the first step in propaganda proofing ourselves, our families, our churches, is emphasizing the importance of the covenant community and the basis of that, the basic part of that, which is the family structure ordained by God for our good. And so parents training their children, supporting each other, brothers and sisters supporting each other. And I'm talking about, physical brothers and sisters as well as spiritual brothers and sisters supporting each other. And being aware of the fact that the people who are bringing all of these things to us, bringing the news to us, bringing our entertainment, bringing the movies, bringing the television shows, bringing the music, they all have an agenda. And that agenda, by and large, is not a good one. And it's not one that we can support. It's not one that absolutely goes against everything that we believe in. And so we need, first of all, the key is awareness. And then after that, awareness of the various different techniques that are used to try to manipulate us and get us to accept things that are absolutely opposed to the truth.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And in that support for each other, which I do agree is very important in the church community. And as we're on the lookout for propaganda, I think one of the other things we do have to keep in mind is that even the church itself as an institution can be and has been weaponized in history by propagandists. More so probably on the liberal side of the spectrum, at least in recent history. Although it's a danger no matter what the church is. Can you talk a bit about how that was done, particularly with Operation Warp Speed?
Yeah, I think I'll talk about Operation Warp Speed, but we can go back even further. And
Sure.
I think that because I think we'll be talking about eugenics a little further on. But in the time in the first opening decades of the 20th century, the eugenics movement was extremely powerful, and it was growing among the intellectual elites, which is the idea that we can save society by careful breeding of human beings. It's like a breeding program that farmers use for cattle, but it's applied to human beings. And so we can breed out of the human race all of these weaknesses that serve to bring society down. So that was the eugenics movement, and we'll talk about that further. But what ended up happening, and what the movers and shakers in the eugenics movement, the intellectual leaders of the movement understood, was that they needed to get a couple of groups on side on their to work towards their agenda. And first of all was the scientists, and then the churches, because the churches at that time, much more so than today, were a very real and very powerful force in society, especially in the United States. And so they needed to get the churches on side. And so they worked to do that. And they turned the what have now become the mainline churches. When we think of the mainline churches in Canada, you can think of the United Church, the Anglican Church, the Presbyterian Church of Canada, those kinds of churches at that time. They turned those churches in the United States, especially, and in Canada, into allies in the battle for racial purity, purity of the human race. And they did things like they had sermon contests, encouraging pastors to preach about eugenics and how the poor and the unfit and the feeble-minded needed to stop breeding, and that how that needed to be imposed on society. And so the church, in this case, the progressive wing of the church, those who believed in the social gospel, those who were thought of as being liberal progressives, they ended up on the side of the people who would lead to the ideology of Adolf Hitler and his eugenics and his idea of the pure master Aryan race. And so in that way, the churches were brought on board, and a very sad moment in the history of the evangelical church in the early 20th century. But when we look to more recent history, and the example of Operation Warp Speed, which was the military, the U.S. military-industrial complex being used together with the medical establishment or the pharmaceutical establishment in the United States to promote promote vaccination against COVID-19. The churches, again, was not something secret. This is not something hidden. This is something that's in the documents of Operation Warp Speed itself. The goal was to very specifically to create programs to get the churches on side to promote all of these projects and programs to support Operation Warp Speed. So there were specific government ministries or government bureaucracies that were set up to get religious leaders, church leaders, synagogue leaders, even Muslim leaders, whatever religion, but especially in inner cities, in Black neighborhoods, to get the church leaders on side to promote the vaccination, promote every aspect of Operation Warp Speed at that time. Knowing that, the church has and continues to have a very strong influence, particularly in some parts of society. And if you can get the church on board, you can get the people on board. And if you can do that, you can manipulate the masses using the church as a tool, using that propaganda.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, and they were somewhat successful with that too.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yeah. And which is a very scary thing when you think about it, when you think about how evangelical leaders could be used in such a way. And in some cases, via money, via funds, via, being or just not even just financial benefit, but also a perceived societal benefit to get on board.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But the church has been the target of propaganda in very many other ways as well, and that includes also not just the evangelical churches, but also the Roman Catholic Church has been the target in the United States of propaganda, especially in the first half of the 20th century, and continuing on until today.
Yep, definitely. So how, you mentioned this earlier about becoming propaganda-proof by supporting, by first of all paying attention, but then also and being aware, but then also supporting our brothers and sisters, obviously both physically and in a spiritual sense in the church, in staying aware and focusing back on Scripture, I guess too would be kind of the ultimate answer. Really, there is that kind of where we're headed on this, just to stay aware.
Well, yeah, I mean, ultimately, I think we need to understand, and one of the my podcast is called Dan 11:32, and so it's one of my favorite central verses. The people who know their God will stand firm and take action. So the first thing we need to do is know our God, and to know our God, we need to know His Word, and we need to know and understand and confess and live according to the confession that His Word is truth, and it's truth with a capital T, and that Jesus Christ is the truth. We also need to understand that the enemy is the father of lies. And so we need to become critical thinkers, and we need to teach critical thinking, and we need to live critical thinking. We need to not be gullible. We need to not be ingenuous. So people who are easily fooled, or people who automatically think the best of everyone. We shouldn't be like that, because we, of all people, as Reformed Christians especially, we should understand total depravity, and we should understand yes, that unbelievers, by God's grace, have been able to accomplish many things in this world, but ultimately, those who are not in service to Christ are in service to Satan. And so I think that's one of the most important things that we need to understand and emphasize. And that will help us to become more skeptical, more critical, better critical thinkers, and evaluate what we hear and what we see with a certain automatic sense of suspicion.
Yep.
And I think that needs to be our starting point.
Yes. Yep, for sure. A large part of the propaganda effort is done through education, in particular the public school system. Can you talk a little bit about the Club of Rome? You mentioned this in your book. This was new to me. And how education is used as a tool for propaganda by elites.
Yeah, absolutely. When we look at our education system, the education system that we've grown up with, that our parents have grown up with, our grandparents have grown up with, a large part of our education system is built on the Prussian education system. So Prussia, prior to the uniting of Germany, Prussia being the dominant force in among the Germanic people, the Prussians, they were very, very good, very skilled and insightful in their development of an education system, which was to create good Prussian citizens, to create good Prussian bureaucrats, to create good Prussian workers, good Prussian administrators, to get society organized and to fall in line. And when you look at the fathers of the American educational system, who built on the foundation of the Prussian educational system themselves, their goal also was to create a homogeneous society where everybody could fill their role. And so they believed that there were certain people who were made to be manual workers. There were other people who were meant to take on leadership and managerial roles, but everybody had to be slotted into their role. And so the goal was to create a good system to create good citizens who would fit in as peaceful citizens and contributing citizens in the country. Along with that, what developed in the 20th century was the entrance of the foundations, the so-called philanthropical foundations, like, for example, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, and the Carnegie Foundation, and others that were founded by the mega rich of the day for their own purposes. And at one point, the educational establishment received more funding from these foundations than they did from the actual state. And so whoever pays the piper calls the tune. And so who was calling the tune in the educational world? Well, it was the Rockefellers, it was the Fords, it was the Carnegies. And they did it for their own purposes because they wanted to ensure that their ever-growing empires had enough worker bees to keep them going. So ultimately, the goal is not the formation of good Christians, as in a Christian school, but it's the formation of good worker bees to work together in the hive and to become interchangeable cogs in the machine, you could say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. If we accept this model of like the Prussian system that it's based upon, and the use of day schools for churning out, the good worker bees, the people that fit into the slots that we would like to see, so to speak, as a society, at least from the elite perspective. If we accept this model, even though we have a very specific reformed education system, are we inherently accepting some sort of worldly propaganda or programming in that?
Well, I think to a certain extent, this is something that really needs to be evaluated. No, not to a certain extent. This is something that really needs to be evaluated. And I think we need to be ready to discuss and evaluate our presuppositions when it comes to education. and we need to ask the question: have we swallowed the presuppositions of the Prussian American educational system and the foundational beliefs that this educational system has? Have we taken that for granted without actually understanding what the purpose behind it was? So we need to ask that question, and we need to have that discussion. I'm not saying I have the answers to that, but what I am saying is that I do believe we need to seriously examine the way that we do school and the purposes for which we do it.
Yeah.
Because I think we work with presuppositions, and we work with ideas that are largely given to us by the world, and we want to fit in the world system, and we want our children to be successful. We want them to earn a good living. We want them to be successful in society. None of those things are bad things, but we need to consider what our educational system is for, how it should be structured. Should it necessarily be structured in the same way that the public school system structures their system? And what I think we certainly need to examine, even more so, is our relationship as independent Christian schools with the public school system and the government system, especially in places where government funding is received. Because once again, with that funding, government funding never comes without strings attached.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So those are some serious questions that we need to ask, and I think that discussion needs to happen.
Yeah. Is there, and this is just off the cuff, so if you don't have a good answer, no problem, but is there any sort of specific model that we can look to in Scripture throughout either Old Testament or New Testament in terms of how the early church or even the Old Testament, how education was done?
Well, I think when we look at the foundation of, because obviously the world of the Old Testament is very different from the modern industrial, post-industrial world in which we live.
Yeah.
Right? We don't live in an agrarian society. But I think for us, the foundation needs to be Deuteronomy 6. Deuteronomy 6, when you train up your children, and Deuteronomy 6 is, when your children ask of you these things, you need to speak of these things as you lie down, as you get up. I'm paraphrasing here, but as you walk by the way, and all of these things. The central aspect of education belongs to the parents, and I think it's the parents who are forming the next generation of God's people, and that cannot be left to the experts. Maybe you don't know science and you need somebody to teach them science. That's fine, but the ultimate formation of the spiritual formation of children is that, and I think that's a reformed presupposition, which we also, in our form for baptism in the Canadian Reformed Church, we talk about that. The one of the vows that parents make when they present their children to be baptized is, do you promise to instruct your children in these things, or have them instructed therein? But ultimately, the primary focus is on the responsibility of parents, and I think that's extremely important. How that, in terms of education in general, how that works itself out, I think is a matter for discussion, and it's a matter for us to think very seriously about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I myself actually just took that vow like a week ago, so it's definitely been on my mind reading this book.
Yeah. Well, congratulations.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, it's pretty cool. Yeah, I don't know if I actually made a good time to update the podcast that my wife and I received a healthy baby girl. At the time you're probably listening to this, it'll be about 5 weeks ago. But yeah, she little Annalise Joy, all is well. So very thankful.
Marvelous.
Yes. Okay. Okay. Just a quick follow up on that. Actually, where does that leave homeschooling then? Because I think that's becoming a more common answer for a lot of parents. And to be honest, it's in my head too, as to like, okay, so 5 years from now, like, what does that mean? Not just because of also the economics of running a school or becoming increasingly challenging, but it's also, because of the education system around us. Do you have any thoughts on homeschooling and if it's a good fit for Christian parents?
Yes, I think there are really two, for me, in my opinion, there are two live options to the Christian day school as we have it now, and that is homeschooling on the one hand, which I believe is a very good option. It's something that we've done throughout our children's educational experience, and also a cooperative model or a hybrid model of homeschooling in cooperation with other parents, which is perhaps not a structured day school, but a more of a cooperative, small scale educational enterprise with that close cooperation between parents. And I think as the challenges increase, and I think they are only going to increase if recent history is any example of that. As the challenges increase, I think more and more Christian families are going to have to look to those options for their children, and for the sake of their children, and for the sake of the spiritual health and the just the general education of the children.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, let's move on from education then. We'll get into, you had a chapter all about the different sexual revolutions, plural, and you can get into that in a moment. But I guess just to set it up, the importance of these sexual revolutions is because they go after the family unit, and the family unit is one of these key mediating structures between the individual and the state. And if it's not there, if it's very weak, we are that much more at risk to be propagandized and to be led astray. So just to set the background for getting into this, can you talk a little bit about the different sexual revolutions and some of the key players involved there?
Yeah. When we think about the sexual revolution, we often think about the 1960s. What happened in the 1960s, especially when it comes to women's liberation, so-called women's liberation movement, the sexual revolution, make love, not war, all of those things that happened in the 1960s, the whole hippie movement, the free love movement, the birth control pill was introduced, and with that, a far more liberated sense of sexuality and what the bounds should be or shouldn't be of the expression of human sexuality. But I use the term sexual revolutions because the story actually goes back much further. Obviously, it goes back to the fall into sin and immediately thereafter. But when we think about modern history, you can look back to the early 20th century to figures such as Wilhelm Reich, who was very, very much a proponent of liberalized sexuality, expressions of sexuality in the early 20th century. Someone like Alfred Kinsey, whose Kinsey report on male sexuality became very well known in the middle of the 20th century, and was very much promoted as a groundbreaking work on sexuality. And then also people like Herbert Marcuse, the Frankfurt School, the school of critical theory, who also promoted sexual liberation as a means of making society better. That if only that all of this repressed sexuality could be expressed, there wouldn't be as much violence, there wouldn't be as much war, because so much of these, there wouldn't be so much competition because which is negative, because so many of these things, people like Herbert Marcuse said, are caused by the repression of sexual desire, which is very, very negative and very damaging. It's something also that Wilhelm Reich said, that when young people repress their sexual desire, they become neurotic, and that affects them throughout their lives. And if they could be free, then they would truly be free to become their best selves. And of course, that translated on to the 1960s as kind of the culmination of those movements of the previous 4 decades, really.
Yeah.
And so it doesn't come, and that's one of the things that I really want to emphasize, is that these things don't come out of nowhere. Oftentimes we're caught by surprise by these things, by these movements. And I mean, I wasn't alive in the 1960s, but I can imagine that Christians at that time your average Christian was probably wondering, how on earth did this happen? Where did these free love people come from?
Yep.
These flower children, where did they come from? What on earth happened? Not understanding that this was the fruit of 4 decades of work in the past, and now coming to fruition. And so,
Totally.
just to bring it to the modern day, perhaps over the past 5 years or so, people have been asking themselves, where on earth did this sudden acceptance of transsexualism come from? Because again, it's something that seems to have just all of a sudden. I mean, I remember probably when I was a kid, so the late 1970s, I remember reading somewhere, because I read a lot of weird things. I remember as a kid, reading somewhere about the early sex change operations that were happening in Sweden. I remember thinking, this is the weirdest thing ever, as a 10-year-old, somehow reading this in a magazine or something. But and so but it was considered to be something very strange. Mm-hmm. And now all of a sudden it's in the news every day, and it's something that's being pushed and forced, and it's coming more and more and more and more. It's being, so you might think, well, where did this come from all of a sudden? Well, again, there's a lot of steps that have gone into bringing us to where we are today in terms of these sexual revolutions. Yeah, and so that's the same. It's the same thing. I just briefly mentioned Alfred Kinsey. Alfred Kinsey, his whole goal was not the dispassionate scientific study of sexuality. He was a man who had an agenda, and he was working with people who had agendas. He was supported by people who had agendas to push a viewpoint about sexuality that society wasn't as sexually prudish as people had been led to believe. And it wasn't as sexually conservative as people were led to believe. And so, going from, the Kinsey study, which was completely, in so many ways, unscientific, used skewed populations to do its surveys, and skewed the results, used leading questions to bring people to certain answers, etc., led to the idea that, for example, 10% of the population is homosexual, which has never been the case. And perhaps as the societal pressure, as the social contagion continues to grow, it may be closer to the case today than it ever was. But throughout, at least modern history, it has not been the case that 10% of society is homosexual. Mm-hmm. It's more like 2 or 3% probably. But that number kind of became fixed in people's thinking because of Alfred Kinsey's work in sexology.
Yep.
And so his work became kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Totally. Today I've seen studies where, the problem with this is they're defining it as LGBTQ, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah. They add more and more identities, so you would think the percentage of people will grow. But in my generation, in Gen Z or Gen Z, however you say that, it's up to 20% in some studies. They'll say are under the LGBTQ rubric. So it definitely is a self-fulfilling prophecy that way. One thing that stuck out to me in this chapter was this idea of generation gap, and I believe that was William Reich who got into that a little bit. With the German people saying you need to liberate yourselves, young people, and the old people don't understand and whatnot. In my head, at least reading this, I always thought, it's just a feature of every generation. The younger generation thinks the older generation doesn't know what they're doing, and the old generation's like, these young kids, look what they're doing. This is crazy. Yeah. But if I read that correctly, this seems to be one of these manufactured ideas that's kind of only come around in the last 100 years or so.
Absolutely. I mean, I think to a certain extent, it always exists to a certain level.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
That between the youth and the older generation, young people will go through a period where they question things, and they are more rebellious. They have to learn to follow their parents. But there's not this dichotomy that's created between the older generation and then the younger generation. So a guy like Wilhelm Reich he looked at the Christian church as being this bastion of elderly, prudish people who didn't want the young people to have any fun.
Mm.
Right? Now, Wilhelm Reich had certain proclivities of his own, which led him to these kind of conclusions. I don't need to say anything more about that, but that's fairly typical among these sexologists. They have their own problems, their own perversions that they're wanting to promote, and that goes for Wilhelm Reich, that goes for Alfred Kinsey, that goes for another one who I don't mention in the book, but if I do a volume 2, I will mention John Money, who is also a very important figure in this history. The same thing. They want to, oftentimes the intellectual elites want to promote their own proclivities or their own perversions, and they want to justify themselves, and that's often what happens. But specifically, when we talk about the generation gap, again, that you're exactly right, that there is that real stark dichotomy between the older generation, the younger generation, which came to its blooming point in the late 1950s and 1960s. Yes, there are some societal movements, the post-war generation, a lot of absent fathers involved in overseas warfare for a long time, etc. A lot of things happened and a lot of developments. But at the same time, that generation gap was being pushed, and it was being emphasized, and it was being strengthened by those in the halls of academia who wanted to create this dichotomy and say, we need to let the young people, there's that the song by Crosby, Stills and Nash about that says, "Teach your parents well." Where the children need to teach their parents. So youth is endued with this with this wisdom that the old no longer have. So yeah, it's that is not, again, it's not something that comes from nowhere.
No, all these, they all come from different ideas and academics often. And yeah, it just takes a few decades, but they do get worked out for sure.
That's right. It's the, they talk about trickle down economics. This is kind of the trickle down theory of ideological and intellectual movements.
Mm-hmm. Indeed.
Which has proven itself again and again.
Yes, this is very true. If listeners are interested, we have a previous episode with Jonathan Marin, and we get into Kinsey and John Money, I believe, if I remember correctly as well. So if you want some more context, go scroll down the feed and check that out later. But for now, we'll move on. Definitely. So for now,
and John Money.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry.
Yeah. No,
John Money is a very important figure. He's a very important figure when we talk about gender ideology and the gender ideology of today. A lot of that flows back to John Money and followers of John Money, and John Money himself was a follower of Kinsey. So
yeah, totally. Okay, we'll shift gears here a bit and get into another one of these topics, which is population control, eugenics, and a big part of eugenics today still is the abortion industry. And I was wondering if you could touch on quickly. We all know how big of a problem abortion is. But I didn't know that Warren Buffett is one of the biggest promoters and supporters of this. I always thought of him as like, oh, this guy's like, I respect him as an investor, smart guy, whatever. But he keeps a low profile, but he's very involved in this apparently.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, that kind of gets back to the left-right dichotomy, because Warren Buffett, one of the biggest financial supporters of abortion worldwide. And people look at him as being kind of this kindly old man, supporter of the Republican Party, all of these kinds of things. But he, together with his partner, whose name escapes me right now, and I don't have the book in front of me,
Charlie Munger.
There we go. They both very much worked together to promote abortion, and abortion as a eugenic tool, as a means of population control. And oftentimes framing their support of abortion, as so many do, as a woman's rights issue, as a compassion issue, using the right terms and using the right catchphrases and the pulling at the right strings to encourage people to accept abortion as, or think of abortion as being something acceptable, when they have they have their agenda, which for many of the elites of society, the Warren Buffetts, the Ted Turners, the Bill Gates of the world, is population control, diminishing the Earth's population, because overpopulation is seen as being the most clear and present danger for all of society. But again, it shows you that the whole left-right dichotomy doesn't really make much difference in this area, because when you look at various movements in terms of the liberalization of abortion, and other similar movements happened in the United States under Republican governors, Republican presidents. Republican elites were heavily involved in Planned Parenthood. The Bushes, for example, George Bush's father was involved in Planned Parenthood. He wrote about it in an introduction to a report on world population in the 1970s. Something that people don't consider. Now they would come out and they would speak against it, but then so you have, on the one hand, you have George Bush's father, who's involved in Planned Parenthood. On the other hand, you have Bill Gates's parents, who are heavily involved in Planned Parenthood as well. So on both sides of the spectrum, you could say the whole issue of abortion, the issue of eugenics, population control, being pushed among the power elites of society.
Totally. Do you want to touch a bit on family size? Obviously, this is well known to everybody, but people have less and less kids today in the Western world, actually increasingly across the entire world. And I think it actually seems, interestingly enough, that some people just out there in the world are waking up to this being a problem. Notably, one of the guys you mentioned in the book earlier, Elon Musk, is actually raising this a lot. So I guess, first of all, on the one hand, do you see the impact of the world having less and less children creeping into the church? And then secondly, what do you make of this kind of new awakening in some of the people outside of the church, such as Elon Musk, noticing that this is a big problem?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, it rains in the world and it drips in the church. And that's, and we see that with family size. As family size, we can thank the Lord that it hasn't been to the extent that it has been in the world, but it has had its impact. Where, and again, there are reasons behind that, and reasons why people believe that they can no longer have families of 10, 12 children, like perhaps our grandparents' generation had. And now maybe it's maximum of maybe 5 or something, like 4 or 5, and then people think that, it's too much. We can't afford it. We can't handle it mentally. We can't handle it financially, and so we stop. We have more children than the world does, but we don't. We're not as fruitful as we could be, and as I believe we should desire to be. Because what happens, and this is where propaganda and education and all of these things come into play. Because to a large extent, we're very heavily influenced by our culture and our society, and by the messages that we're, being bombarded with on all sides. And so it's no surprise where, we're told that children are expensive, and that they take a lot of our time, and they take a lot of our freedom, and each child needs to have a certain amount of individual attention. And if we can't give them that individual attention, then we're actually abusing them. So if you have, say 9 children, some people will look at that and they'll say, well, that's child abuse, because you can't give your child attention the way that they should have it. Not understanding that when you have a family of 9 children, the children in many ways raise each other, as the older ones help out with the raising of the younger ones. And so there's so many things that go together. A large family isn't nearly as onerous as people have been led to believe. And we need to also change our expectations when it comes to what we do with our children, and what we think that we need to provide for our children. If you have 12 children, you don't have to put all 12 children in hockey and pay however many thousands of dollars that costs for equipment and rental and everything else.
Yeah.
So expectations need to be changed, and God's the privilege that we've received from God to be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. That command has not been fulfilled.
Yeah.
I'm here in Brazil. Brazil has 220 million people. It is one of the largest cities in the world, which is São Paulo. But yesterday we drove here to a city in the interior, and there's still a lot of empty space here. So we're not full yet.
Yeah.
It's not like there's no vacancy, and it's been proven again and again, throughout history, that the population control advocates have been wrong, and have been wrong, badly wrong, when they said the earth cannot support any more population. Yeah. Absolutely incorrect.
Yeah, we need growth. We need more people.
Yeah, absolutely. Because with more people comes also more ingenuity, more ideas, more intellect put toward solving the problems of humanity in terms of, okay, well, how can we support this many people? Well, if you have more people to work on these things and to develop and to work in the sciences and to work in all of these areas, there are ways and means, and that's been proven. So, but this has been this whole idea of population control has been an elite part of the elite agenda for centuries, going back to Thomas Malthus in the 18th century, and then on through people like H.G. Wells into the 20th century, people like Julian Huxley, the father of transhumanism, and on through to the beginning of the environmental movement. Throughout, it has been the elites of society who have said we need less, to use an expression, we need less useless eaters in this world, because it's otherwise it's the population bomb that's going to explode. Mm-hmm. So as Christians, I think we really need to take seriously the creation mandate that God's given to us. That creation mandate has not ended.
No.
To be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. Because, the more children we have, the more voices we have to lift themselves up to praise God.
Very true. Very true. And I'll make the counter case for a second, or not full counter case, but just a slight pushback on that is that I would say economically, compared to at least our parents' generation, speaking for people my age, it does seem to be economically much more challenging to raise a large family in this day and age, where housing is just very unaffordable, and currently inflation is not an all-time high, but still quite high at this point. Interest rates are up and all that jazz. I'm not saying it's a great excuse, and it wouldn't stop me personally, but I do have some sympathy for people who are in a tough position, and if you're on a fixed salary or whatnot, like you're in a situation where you're not sure if you'll make more money in 10 years or not. Like I'm banking on, hopefully I'll be able to do that, but I don't know. You kind of go forward in faith, but it is a tricky scenario that way. At least I see it.
You're correct. You are correct. And that is completely deliberate as well.
For sure.
This doesn't come by accident either.
Yep.
Also, and this also has to do with the entire women's liberation movement as well, where the idea is that women need to be in the workforce.
Yeah.
And why? Well, it's because, again, the kind of rhetoric that's used is it's because we want women to be all that they can be, and we want them to be equal contributing members of society, and we want them to be on the same level as men, and all of these things, all these very high sounding ideas and motivations, which have nothing to do with the real purpose for this happening, which is more people to pay taxes, more people to contribute to government programs if women are in the workforce, more power for the government as the government is entrusted with the care of children. Leads to smaller families as well, as women want to have less children, and people no longer can live the life to which we have been accustomed on a single salary.
Yeah. Very
Because
true.
all of these, it's like a giant web where all of these things go together.
Yep. Yeah, I know it's a big problem.
Your point is well taken.
Yeah.
Because it is a challenge, and it is probably, well, definitely more of a challenge than it was, say, in the 1970s or 1960s.
Mm-hmm. You really have to like wrestle with that, I think, as young people, as young parents, young couples. Like if we're gonna go down this road, and unless you have upsized income potential, if you're just an average person making average money, working an average job, you're gonna have to definitely be like fine if you're gonna go the route of having, like, let's say 7, 8 kids, something like that. It's gonna be a quality of life downgrade compared to what you were used to growing up, most likely, which is tough to take.
Yeah, well, it depends on how you define quality of life.
Well, that's fair. That's a fair point. Yeah, but yeah, you'll have less disposable income. Let's put it that
Correct.
way.
Yeah, I think that's a better way of putting it. Probably.
That's fair. No, that's fair. That's a bit of propaganda sneaking into my vocabulary. Yeah. So keep me on guard. That's good. Critical thinking. I like it. Okay, so we're gonna run up on time here. Quickly, maybe let's hit, because we should end off with a positive note about what we can do. But maybe let's hit environmentalism, that movement, Earth Day, and then we'll hit transhumanism, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. Okay. So
right.
so go
yeah.
Go ahead,
so a little bit about the environmental movement. And I have a chapter about the environmental movement in the book. One of the things that we need to be good stewards of creation. And I think that almost should go without saying for us as Christians. We're not people who are here to get the maximum out of this earth and rape and pillage and destroy the environment. We should be, of all people, the people who care the most about being good stewards and developing God's creation according to His will and for His glory, and for the benefit of the human race as well. And ultimately, that means caring for what has been given to us. So when I speak strongly against the environmental movement, I'm not saying that we as Christians should not care for the environment, because of all people, we should be the most caring for this world that God has given to us, this beautiful creation. But what I think we really need to understand is, again, where the environmentalist movement comes from. And the environmentalist movement is, again, the product of the elites, the societal elites, the power elites, the financial elites of this world. We can look at it. We can look at the modern outworking of this in what we see with the entire climate change industry, the entire climate change message, the message of carbon reduction. We are carbon-based beings, so if we want to get rid of carbon, we need to get rid of humans. And the idea that this is our besetting problem, and we need to start carbon pricing, and we need to start all of these kinds of programs to undo the environmental problems that we're facing, the imminent doom that we're faced with. So that's the most recent iteration of this, but it goes back in its modern, again, its modern incarnation, you could say. The environmentalist movement really sees its roots in the late 1960s or in the 1960s, and then coming to its bloom in 1970 with the first Earth Day. Mm-hmm. And the first Earth, we think of Earth Day, perhaps those of us who are on the conservative side of the spectrum, we think of Earth Day as this liberal, horrible, socialist, hippie, nasty thing where people want to get rid of industry and they're tree huggers and all this stuff. And a lot of environmentalists want to proclaim the environmental movement as this grassroots movement, which it never was. The environmentalist movement was never a grassroots movement, and it was always the brainchild of big business and industry, the oil industry, the international oil industry, the international banks, the financial power intellectual elites working together with this agenda in mind. And if you look at the history of the first Earth Day, you can see it. And it goes on from there. And again, there's all these connections. That's why I speak about the web, or how all of these things work together: population control, environmentalism, all of these various movements working together and being different sides of the same coin, you could say.
Mm-hmm. It's very profitable to have that going.
Absolutely. It's the big green movement produces a lot of green as well for people.
Yes.
If you're positioned in the right place.
If you're Al Gore.
Well, exactly. Yeah. Al Gore is one of the examples that I speak about in the book. And the example of Al Gore is it's incredible.
Yeah.
When you see where he came from and where he is now, and how he went from being a career politician to being an advisor in multinational corporations, and to being the producer of The Inconvenient Truth, the big global warming documentary, and just making that really hit the public, and what he has personally gained out of that is immense. His financial and power gains in these things. So, Al Gore, there are many other examples as well in the environmental movement. So what that leads me to, when we think about, okay, where the rubber hits the road for us as Christians. Okay, so great. So we know that this is some kind of, to put it in the crudest possible terms, this is a giant scam. Okay, so what do we do? What is it? So what? What does this mean for us? Well, it means that we need. Well, I think first of all, it means that we need to again cast a skeptical eye on the kind of reporting that we hear, the kind of messages that we are being led to swallow, the doomsday scenarios that are being outlined for us and have been outlined for us for decades. We need to cast a skeptical eye on these things. We need to be critical consumers of the information that we receive. We need to look at various sides of the issues, and we need to, in our own situations, we need to follow again God's creation mandates.
Mm-hmm.
Not be sucked in by these false and dangerous and ultimately pagan movements, which are being used by those with a greater agenda, an agenda often to achieve more power. And if you look at things like the United Nations Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030, and all of those kinds of things, they use the environmental movement, among other things, for their own purposes.
Yeah. Just to get some clarity on that. So the movement, I think what you're calling the movement itself, and the people who use it for their purposes, that is a scam. But the problem with any good scam or whatnot is there's always a grain of truth inside of it. I on the issue of climate change specifically, like from my understanding, and we did an episode on this a while back too, Cal Beisner, but I've also seen others like Bjorn Lomborg and whatnot. It is a problem, but it's one problem of many, and it is nowhere near the problem that it is being made out to be. Is that a fair understanding?
Well, I would agree with that. And I think one of the things that ends up happening is that with all of the focus, like all of the focus recent years has been on carbon and carbon dioxide and carbon emissions, and very much less focus or little focus on things like water pollution and dioxins or cancer-causing chemicals or other things that big industry is also causing serious problems with the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Or the production of mountains of garbage, or where garbage is being shipped to different parts of the world. So all of those things are if you pay enough in carbon offsets, you can continue to do all of these things.
Yeah, it's a modern day indulgence.
Yeah, well, exactly. You pay your indulgence, and then you can take your private jet. You can go to your international meeting in Davos without feeling any guilt. But the little guy isn't allowed to do it anymore.
Yeah.
So Bill Gates can do it, and he says that himself recently in an interview. He said that, well, I pay my carbon offsets. Well, I can't pay my carbon offsets. So does that mean I can't fly anymore?
Yeah.
So, but there,
Yeah.
and so there are other problems. When you see, just in terms of, you think of, well, God created this world beautiful, right? We live in a beautiful world, and how man can make the world so ugly, and that includes cities, where cities are not, in so many ways, they have become places of where beauty is completely lacking.
Yeah.
And the idea of, you think about Revelation. In Revelation, the eschatological endpoint is this garden city. Well, we think of paradise in terms of just a garden, or perhaps a wild space. And so what ends up happening is you have these islands of pristine perfection, a national park where nobody's allowed to set foot. And then you have these horrible, ugly, nasty places that are, the sprawling suburbs or whatever, where everything looks the same, and there's no individuality. And those things are all environmental concerns as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So and in terms of growing rates of cancer, what's causing that? Why are so many people getting cancer? What kind of chemicals are we putting into our bodies? What kind of foods are we eating? What kind of chemicals are being used in agricultural production? What kind of pesticides are we using to levels that are unsustainable? All of those kinds of questions.
Totally. Okay.
So there's a lot more than just carbon.
Oh, I know. It's a big problem. It is a big problem.
Okay. And there's no denying that.
Yeah.
But I think the problem is, and the problem that we need to see is that the movement, itself has so much or so little to offer to actually make things better.
Yeah. It's a lot of just rhetoric. It's not actual. There's no. It's environmentalism. It's not conservation. Like, there's no actual tangible. Like, we're going to take this habitat and improve it, or we're going to open up access over here, or clean up the ocean, or there's a million ways to do it tangible.
Yeah. Okay. Exactly.
Okay, so we're running up against the clock here. So I think where we're going to leave it is, there is a chapter in your book on transhumanism. It is interesting and fascinating, and I think people should definitely go read it. But I think for the sake of time, we'll kind of enter into like the close-up portion of this podcast, the concluding portion, and we'll kind of tell people, knowing all this, knowing there are these forces at work, knowing that the elites do want to use us and the rest of humanity for their purposes, because they crave power, because they worship the god of self. What do we do knowing all this? What are some tangible steps we can do, both as individuals, as a member of your church, as parents, grandparents? Like, how then shall we live in light of all this that we've discussed?
Yeah, and that's the last chapter of the book. In the last chapter of the book, I give a list of a number of suggestions of the kinds of things that we can do to not just fortify ourselves against these things, but also to fight back against them. And I think one of the key issues, and I'm not going to get into each one of the. I don't have the list in front of me. At I think it's 19 suggestions, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not going to get into each individual part of that list, but I think one of the things that we need to consider is our own particular sphere of influence. Because oftentimes, having a podcast, and I'm sure you get the same thing, you get a lot of messages, individual messages from people who listen to the podcast. And one of the questions that I get most often is, well, what can we do? What can I do to change it? What can I do to make sure that this doesn't happen? Well, my answer is, there may be nothing that you can do to change it as an individual, to make an impact on a worldwide level, because you're just a little person in a great big world. For most of us, we don't have a lot of power. We don't have a lot of influence. We don't have a huge sphere of influence in our life, and we're not loaded down with money that we can use to buy that kind of influence. So we need to work, and we should work joyfully within our own sphere of influence, and know that in that sphere of influence, we can make a huge difference. So think locally, first of all. and think on the local level. And when we think about government, we often think about, national government or state government, but locally, being involved locally on a political level is extremely important. But even not even getting to that political level is on the level of ourselves and our families, and fortifying and strengthening our families, fortifying and strengthening our churches, resolving to live deliberately as God's covenant community and not as isolated, atomized individuals in our society. I think that's extremely important, because I think one of the doctrines, one of the teachings that we should never neglect is the doctrine of the covenant, and how we are God's covenant people, and how God placed us and created us in his image to live as a reflection of who our triune God is, and to be that light to the world simply by living deliberately as God's people in the public eye. All right. Okay, so we need to think locally or act locally, in terms of the bigger picture. We may not have a global influence, and that's okay, because another one of the things that we need to think of is that God wants us to be faithful. He doesn't want us to make a difference. He wants us to be faithful. So regardless of the impact or the change that's worked by our faithfulness, we're called to do it. And so we may not see results in our lifetime, and we may work towards certain things and we may not see it. But if we're faithful to what God has commanded us to do and what he expects from us, then that will be blessed. And so we need to work with that idea.
Mm-hmm.
And some of the other things, very practical things that I believe that all of us as Christians should be doing, understanding especially the pernicious nature of big tech, especially, and just to give some very practical examples, and big data, because I think a lot of people lack an understanding of the importance of our data to this entire, global agenda or globalist agenda. The fact that our data is being collated and used and is being put together, we see it most recently in the development of ChatGPT, the whole AI thing. That's all the result of a massive data gathering project. It's not artificial intelligence in the real sense of the term, but it's just the result of a tremendously powerful algorithm that has mountains of data at its fingertips, its virtual fingertips.
Yep.
And so each time that we willingly use a free service on the internet where we think it's free, it's not really free. It's our data, we are actually the product. And so ultimately that's what we need to realize. So we need to, I think, I encourage Christians in particular to think about what kind of data we're sharing and how we're contributing or feeding the beast.
Yep.
Which is the beast of data gathering and the beast of that data collation and data use. So we need to think very carefully about that.
Totally.
So that's just one practical way in which we can do that, in that we can work, and also working to not be as dependent on the societal structures as we have been, and to become more independent or interdependent.
Yeah.
As God's people, and as the world, as society becomes more and more, as it becomes more and more difficult, at least in this generation, to live in a Christian way, more challenging. We need to rely on our brothers and sisters. We need to support our brothers and sisters as well, and create alternative economies. So, as much as possible, use the skills of our brothers and sisters. We have the perfect kind of community that God has put us in for us to use. So we need to think in that way, in that community oriented way as well, just in very practical ways.
Totally. Yeah. Just building up those mediating institutions like we talked about, especially
Absolutely.
The church and the family. That's where you can have a big impact.
Yeah.
Okay. All
That's
very
absolutely
good.
correct.
Wonderful. Okay. Well, I think we'll bring it to a close. This has been fantastic. There's still so much more to discuss. People
I
go
know
on. Yeah,
we didn't get through a lot of it, but I think we covered a lot. So
we did.
it was very good.
Yes, definitely. Well, if people are interested, they can go buy your book. Can you tell people where to go buy your book?
One of the places where you can get it, and probably the best place for you to go look, is go to my website, www.dan1132 in numerals.com. So www.dan1132.com, and get in touch with me, and leave a message on the contact form there. So there's the hardcover version of the book is available for $15, and there's also the audiobook, which is also available, read by the author, which
Very
is
nice.
me. So that's available for $10.
Okay. And can they get the audiobook on your website as
yes.
well? Okay.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Not part of Amazon though, as we don't want to feed the beast.
I don't want to feed the beast, so it's not available on Amazon. So,
yes.
And the thing is, I'm also not on Facebook for the same reason.
Mm-hmm.
And so that actually, and I'm also not on YouTube for the same reason. I know this video is going to go up on YouTube, right?
Yeah.
So which is a good thing. I mean, I think it's good to reach as many people as you can. But automatically, what you're doing, if you avoid these arms of the octopus, you limit your reach, which is unfortunate. So,
yeah. Well, I think we'll have to look at honestly switching to Rumble. I think that seems to be a bit of a trend, and hopefully audiences will migrate over there as well. So
yeah,
stay tuned for
that.
Yeah,
Rumble's really growing. So it's good.
Good. Awesome. Well, Pastor Jim, thank you for your time. It's been real talk. It's been my pleasure. Hopefully your pleasure as well. And till next time.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Well, thanks very much for having me. It was a lot to say, a lot to talk about. It was very good to talk with you.
Wonderful. Okay, people. Well, let us know what you think. Until next time, keep having real talk. Bye-bye. Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Real Talk. We really appreciate you taking the time to listen or watch the show. If you want to send us your feedback, and we'd love to hear it, please email us at reformedrealtalk@gmail.com. If you want to find us online or social media, we got a lot of great content there. Just search Reformed Real Talk and we should come right up. This show is created and produced by myself, Lucas Holtfluer, and Tyler Vanderwood, and our wonderful podcast manager who does all the editing is Mariah Tamiga. So we're really thankful for her contribution to the show as well. That's all for now, folks. Thanks for watching or listening, and we'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.